Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay, just Jay, your resident troublemaker and your resident culture warrior and your resident Tolkien defender. Anyway, I hope you are all doing well as we head on into the New Year's celebration, at least for those of us here in the West that celebrate New Year's Day coming up this Saturday. Well, New Year's Day is Sunday, but Saturday night into Sunday is when everybody's celebrating. So, you know, everyone's going to be getting their drink on and partying. And I hope you will be surrounded by friends and family and those who you care about and sending the year of 2022 on its way and welcoming in the new one of 2023. I know I will. Anyway, I hope you're doing all doing well. I know there wasn't any videos yesterday. It's been like a crazy time and stuff like that. So I had to take a day. Didn't have time to put anything together. So I apologize for that. But let's jump right in because there's several articles I wanted to touch base on, sort of like the final time of 2022. These are like the last ones, I guess. Here's what I'm going to do. These are going to come out today like normal, how I normally do stuff. I see articles and I sort of dissect them and take them apart and agree or disagree with them. Tomorrow, I'm trying to work on something for sort of the end of the year, and I'm hoping I can have it done for tomorrow. But cross fingers, and I will let you guys know. Nothing major, nothing super special, but just a more of a long term thing that I've sort of been like, recording B-roll and sort of editing as things have been going on. So I'm hoping to get that out for you tomorrow. But let's get right into these stories right now. This first one comes to us from CBR.com, and it is how The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings novels were received on release. Okay. I don't know about you guys. I am not old enough to have been around when they were released initially. I believe 1937 was The Hobbit. I know it was in the 1930s. I just don't remember the exact year, but I know 1954 was when The Lord of the Rings was released, or first published, I should say. All right, The Lord of the Rings has become one of the most recognizable franchises, but how were Tolkien's original novels received upon their release? It is hard to remember a time before Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy, as these movies became instant classics in cinema and showed exactly what the fantasy genre is capable of. While J.R.R. Tolkien's stories have been popular for a long while, there's no denying that the franchise wouldn't be where it is today without the movie trilogy. So, with how solidified The Lord of the Rings is in pop culture nowadays, it's fascinating to look back at the original novel's reception and release. Okay, I just want to say right out of the gate, I'm pretty sure I know what the thought process is here, and we'll discuss it afterward. Okay, so there's a huge amount of fans who were first introduced to Middle-earth through cinema, but that doesn't mean there weren't plenty of people who grew up reading The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. A prime example is Saruman's actor Christopher Lee, who read the books every year long before getting the role. However, no matter which side of the spectrum a fan falls on, there's an ever-decreasing amount who remember the original release. The Hobbit released to universal praise. Tolkien's writing career can be traced all the way back to the trenches of World War I, where he began writing much of the mythology that would one day become Middle-earth. But Tolkien wouldn't write The Hobbit until the early 1930s, after the iconic line, quote, "In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit," unquote, popped into his head. By 1932, the first copy of The Hobbit made its way to a publisher by the name of George Allen and Unwin, based in the United Kingdom. And with a positive impression made on the owner and his young son, The Hobbit was finally printed for publication. 1,500 copies of The Hobbit were first released to the public on September 21st, 1937. Okay, so I was right. It was 1937. And it was sold out within a couple of months. Rave reviews immediately flooded the scene, calling The Hobbit one of the best modern children's books around. Over the next few years, new editions of the book were sold across Britain and America with constant positive reception. However, the coming of World War II meant that publishing slowed down considerably. So while the book was celebrated, Tolkien was still far from the popular figure he is today. Okay. The Lord of the Rings saw mixed reviews. With the success of The Hobbit, Tolkien was pushed to work on a sequel, which he called A New Hobbit. This would later become The Lord of the Rings, but he clearly felt no need to rush things, as throughout World War II he drafted and restarted the trilogy numerous times. Finally, in 1950, he was ready to publish and wanted The Lord of the Rings to be released alongside his other novel, The Silmarillion. But with how different The Lord of the Rings was compared to The Hobbit, it was already a tough sell to publishers. So the addition of the complex Silmarillion didn't go down that well. Nevertheless, The Lord of the Rings was released as 3 books over the course of 1954, and reviews were far more mixed than before. Critiques ranged from calling it one of the best stories of the 20th century to others calling it nothing more than a story of boys acting as adult heroes. These mixed opinions carried over to the general audience, where some thought it was incredible and others found it to be overambitious. Even so, that didn't stop the sales from coming in, as The Lord of the Rings has been constantly pushed out across the world from release to modern day. Reception of the Lord of the Rings trilogy gradually became more positive over time, and the book's popularity in America skyrocketed. Tolkien himself became more famous and noticeable in public, forcing him to move house and take his name out of the phone book. And by the time of his death in 1971, he was marked as one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. All right. So, first of all, yes, okay. I thought it was 1937, and turns out that I was correct. Yes, from what I understand in the documentaries I've seen, and I own a couple of documentaries, especially the documentaries on Tolkien and his work that were pumped out in the early 2000s, when the Peter Jackson trilogy came out, like, National Geographic and a whole bunch of these did these like 2-hour documentaries, as well as, I've got some of the BBC stuff, old interviews and stuff like that I watched just to see what was going on in the man's mind. Anyway, yes, so 1937, yeah, apparently The Hobbit was received well, and that makes sense. The fact that he was asked to do a sequel means that it would have been a very popular book at the time. The sales would have been really, really good. Otherwise, publishers aren't going to, push you for a sequel. Now, The Lord of the Rings, it met some mixed review. That one comment they say where somebody's referred to it as it's just boys acting like adult heroes. I used to know who said that quote. I think it was somebody else that was like a big literary person, or maybe somebody associated with Oxford or something like that. I remember hearing that before, and that's the only like real criticism I heard. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that Ben Hardwick is the person who wrote this article. I'm not disputing the fact that Lord of the Rings may have met more or had less critical acclaim than The Hobbit upon first release. Now, but let's put it in perspective, okay? The Lord of the Rings trilogy being released, the books being released in 1954, okay? And by the time of his passing in 1971, Tolkien was already considered the father of modern fantasy genre. Okay, so if you do 1954 to 1971, you find that that's only 17 years, right? That's only 17 years, right? If my math is correct, 54. Yep. It's only 17 years. So the implication that it was this long, drawn out process that slowly over time he built, people came around to it. So no, by the 1960s, okay, and this I know for a fact because my mom was one of those flower power hippie children, and my dad was a Marine in Vietnam. So they knew. To put a little perspective, folks, my brother was conceived at the original Woodstock. Just to put it in perspective, okay? But I know, having talked with my mother and stuff like that, Tolkien was already huge amongst the college age hippie. I don't want to just say hippie movement because I'm sure it wasn't just the sort of hippie free love flower child movement, but amongst that age group, right? The 20 somethings looking for direction, looking for something out of life, still getting started on their journey. already by the mid to late 60s, Tolkien was huge. So that would even take it to be less than 17 years. If we just go to say 1967, right? And I'm just randomly picking a year, right? That's literally only 13 years. Well, to put that in perspective, that is less time than has been between now, the time you're watching this video, and the time that Peter Jackson's trilogy came out, because that's the Two Towers came out 20 years ago this year, right? And 21 years ago for Fellowship of the Ring. So the fact that Tolkien was already established as one of the greatest writers of the 20th century and the father of the sci-fi I would say the fantasy genre, right? In less than 15 years. Okay, so the only issue I have with the argument is that the implication there is that it took Tolkien a while to build up this fandom. Now, I don't dispute that Peter Jackson's films obviously have sort of reinvigorated and pumped a sort of given new momentum to Tolkien's work and his popularity. That definitely comes from Peter Jackson's and stuff like that. Peter Jackson's films, but in his own time, just based on his books, before there were any films or adaptation, it took Tolkien literally less than 15 years to solidify himself as the father of the fantasy genre, and for everyone to hail The Lord of the Rings as being this literary masterpiece. Less than 15 years. My issue is that the article sort of implies that, if you just look at it from 1954 until now, and you're saying, oh my God, that's like almost 50 years, and, or more than 50 years, I should say, half a century to solidify its position. No, it was already in that position by the late 1960s, so less than 15 years. And the reason why I think they're doing this is, again, and I know this is going to sound sort of like conspiracy theory, and YouTube hates that, but it's because this is sort of the psychological games that get played by the media. Again, I have a media background, and nothing is left to chance. None of this stuff is just done on a whim. The psychological underpinnings of this, I think, are to sort of instill in you this concept that, well, you may not like the Rings of Power now. You may not be a fan of it. It may not be getting the critical acclaim that it deserves now. But neither did Tolkien, right? And that's the sort of underlying subtext to this article, right? And that's why I'm making such an issue of pointing out that, no, if the books came out in 1954, by 1967, 13 years later, Tolkien was already solidified. The books were already solidified as literary masterpieces that they are. And he was already solidified, as this literary giant that he is. Within 13 years, and the article, I think that the overall intent of the article is to sort of paint this picture of like, well, it could be applied to Rings of Power. Tolkien's books, when they first came out, they sort of had mixed reviews, just like the show has mixed reviews. But over time, fans came to love them and cherish them, and I'm sure they'll do the same thing with this show. And I'm here to tell you, absolutely not. 13 years from now, I guarantee you we'll still be hearing what a shit show Rings of Power is. 30 years from now, nobody will be talking about the show. It will have long been, tossed into the dustbin of history. But Tolkien's works will still be going. We know that for a fact. Anyway, let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Do you think that, what's your take on the Lord of the Rings books having been met with quote unquote mixed reviews? And do you think that the subtext and the intent of this article is to sort of draw that comparison of like, oh well, the Rings of Power is met with mixed reviews, and just like Tolkien's work, and over time it'll have the same outcome? Do you think that's the thing, or no? Or am I just crazy and I just reading into it? I've seen enough of these articles where it's just like, ugh. Anyway, guys, I hope you are all doing well. Remember, if you like the video, like the video. If you want to share the video, by all means, feel free to do so. It gets it out there and gets it seen by more people. If you have not subscribed yet, I would hope that you would consider giving your subscription to the channel. And if you have subscribed and are a returning viewer, thank you very much. You are awesome. Again, I will see you guys on the next one as we close in on the end of year. Until then, be good, be safe, be awesome. Peace.